All right, so today we've got the sixth session of our technical communication workshop, and we are going to talk about graphics today, namely incorporating graphics into the text and also choosing graphics that are effective. You guys might or might have not been here in the past, but we've covered topics from punctuation, sentence structure, to conciseness, clarity, person, and voice, and all of the slides from the past presentations and some other materials and audio recordings of the last presentations are on the G3513 website, which we'll have a link to at the end of the slideshow, so you can go look at that stuff and the slides from today on your own time if that's what you want to do. All right, so like I said, today we're going to talk about incorporating graphics into the text and also choosing graphics that work for us, that are effective and that help communicate things to our audience in a way that a lot of times saves us the trouble of having to write more. Right? When we talk about a graphic that actually works very well, in a lot of cases it's a graphic that takes up less space and less time on the reader's part than actual just textual explanation. And in a lot of cases, readers, including ourselves, are visual learners, right? If you can show me something on a graph, on a bar graph, and explain that graph to me in a few sentences, I'm generally going to get the idea better than if you just explain the idea to me in, say, 2 paragraphs, right? So when we talk about using graphics, it's sometimes easy to forget that even though we can use graphics that illustrate things, they still have to be carried with the text. And so we still have to include textual information, explanations of these graphics so the audience gets the full idea, right? But so first we'll talk about incorporating graphics in the text and what we have to do to make sure that the graphics are clear and explained and the audience knows they're going to get a graphic. And then we'll talk about some good qualities of graphics, and we'll also talk about some things that graphics can do that actually work against their effectiveness. All right, so when we talk about incorporating graphics, there's really only a few rules that we need to keep in mind to make sure that we do it in a way that the audience knows they're fixing to, that the audience knows they're about to get a graphic and what to look for, right? The first thing is that we want to make sure we introduce the graphic in the text, right? And once we get through this slide, I've got some examples, so we'll see how all these work. So we want to make sure that before we have a graphic in a text document, whatever it is, that we mention it. So the audience knows in just a few sentences or later on this page, I'm going to see a graphic. So we want to make sure that we don't just have a graphic pop up out of nowhere and they're not expecting it. So we want to introduce it in the text. We want to label the graphic. And we'll talk about how we label graphics, whether they're figures or tables and the differences with those labels and what kind of information we need in a label for a graphic. We want to make sure that in the text, whether before or after or both, before or after the graphic or both, that we explain the graphic, right, and that we reference it throughout the explanation so that we tell the audience what we want them to get out of a graphic and we point to specific points in that graphic so they know where to look. Right? Because in a lot of cases we're dealing with graphics that are complicated enough that there might be 4 or 5 different things the audience could pay attention to, which might not be the same 4 or 5 things we want them to, right? So explaining to the audience what the graphic is about and pointing back to it in the text. And the last thing, which is kind of a simple idea, but a lot of times if it's not done, it can cause problems, is that when we use graphics, we want them to appear in the text as close as possible to that explanation. So if we can imagine reading a document and we're halfway down the page and we see, as shown in figure 1, and then at the bottom of that page we see figure 1. Then we can read the explanation and we can see the graphic on the same page, right? We're looking at one page and it's all there, versus seeing or reading a document and then halfway down this page you say, as shown in figure 1, and there's no figure on the page, and so you have to flip around to look for that graphic, right? So we want to make sure that as best we can, and in some cases it might not be feasible, but as best we can, we have that graphic next to its explanation so people don't have to flip back and forth to find the graphic that we're actually talking about. Okay, so we always want to introduce, point number 1, we always want to introduce the graphic in the text before the graphic appears. So here we've got an example that I've pulled out of a technical description paper. So we've got a section, flexibility of AutoCAD, international uses of the product, and user. I'll just read this out and we'll talk about how it works. International uses of the product and user-friendly customization are two of the flexible options AutoCAD offers. With AutoCAD, engineers are able to work virtually side by side with each other, even across the world. The ability for one engineer to draw up a drawing and send it away to another engineer to work on the same drawing has never been done so easily and effortlessly before AutoCAD. And then we get Figure 1, a AutoCAD design, and we have the graphic, which is not, it's not very clear, but that's not really the point right now. So, in this paragraph leading up to this graphic, have we mentioned, well, we can leave it up there. We don't have an introduction to the graphic, right? Nowhere in this explanation do we say something like, as shown in Figure 1, all right? So that we know when we're reading this that there's something in this graphic that helps it make sense, that helps illustrate the points that we're making, right? And so in this is what we want to avoid. We want to make sure that if we have a figure that somewhere in the text leading up to it, we point the reader to Figure 1, or as you can see in the illustration below. There's a lot of different ways you can do it. It doesn't really matter how you do it, but it does matter that you point the reader to the figure, that you tell them that they're about to get a figure. So this one needs an introduction. Now let's look at this one. The photograph below shows the testing of the thermal protection system tiles and the extreme temperatures they're able to withstand. Each tile must experience this type of punishment on each re-entry. Ceramics are the only type of material that can withstand these high temperatures. Then we get Figure 1, the testing of ceramic tiles in extreme heat, and we've got our figure. Here we've got an introduction, right? The photograph below shows, and then they talk about and they explain some of the things. They could have explained in more detail, but they've got an explanation of what it is we see here. So when we read this paragraph, we know that it relates to this figure, that we're going to see, that we're going to get an explanation here that is then illustrated down here. And so we get a fuller idea. And even to the point, when I said earlier, when we use graphics effectively, in a lot of cases we're doing it so that we actually have to write less, which translates into the reader having to read less. And a lot of times we get the idea more clearly communicated with fewer words. And if we look at this explanation that introduces the figure versus this one that doesn't, they're fairly similar, but this one gives us a better idea because it introduces the figure, and it's fewer words, right? It's shorter, so there's less to read, right? It's a simpler graphic as well, but there's still less to read. Okay, so here we have an introduction. Now, the second point, we want to make sure that anytime we have a graphic that we label it, okay? When we talk about labeling a graphic, I'm going to primarily focus on how we label a graphic in IEEE style, and one of the examples is in APA style. So the point here is that when you label a graphic, depending on what documentation style you're using, the labeling might be different. So the rules that I'm going to talk about are only related to IEEE. You guys know what I'm talking about, IEEE style, APA, MLA style, Chicago style. These vary from different publications, different teachers, and whatever. So as long as you know the publication documentation style you're working in, you should know, or you can look up easily how those figures need to be labeled. But in any case, we'll stick with IEEE because that's what we use in our classes, and you might be somewhat familiar with. So for our figure labels, for our graphic labels, I should say, we need to number it. And it's either numbered as figure 1, 2, 3, 4, or table 1, 2, 3, 4. And here's how we figure out if it's a figure or a table. If it's not a table, it's a figure, right? So that makes it fairly easy. If we have a table, columns, rows, then it's table number 1. If it's anything else, a picture, a bar graph, an illustration, a screenshot, then it's a figure, right? So tables are tables, everything else is a figure. So we want to have it figure number 1, figure number 2, figure 3, table 1, table 2, table 3, and so on. The next thing we want in our label is a brief description or a title, right? And a lot of times if we are using graphics that we say have borrowed, if we've gone and found a graphic on the internet, or if we've gotten out of a textbook, or from another source, whatever it might be, sometimes those graphics will already have a title. And if that's the case, that's fine. But we want to make sure that title is in our label, right? In a lot of cases, the graphics might not have a title, or the title that they have is not as relevant to our purpose or is not as illustrative as it can be. And so you're free to amend that title and give it your own title, right? And if we can give it a title that is closely related to what we need that graphic to do, that's generally better. But the idea is figure number 1, give it a brief description or title, right? And the last thing is if we have borrowed that graphic from another source, internet, book, website, whatever, then we have to cite it. And so, again, like I said, this differs from documentation style to documentation style. The examples I'm going to show you are IEEE style and APA, but in different styles, you cite things differently. So, like I said, you'll know which documentation style you're working in, cite it like it should be for that style. The main point, or the larger point here is, if you've borrowed it, you have to cite it. And so that citation goes at the end of our label, right? So, to make it simple, 3 things: figure or table number, title, and citation, right? So here we've got a graphic that is not labeled, right? So this is a problem. Why is this a problem? What do we not get out of this graphic without it being numbered, titled, or cited? Okay, you don't know who it is, right? We've obviously got a person here. We don't know who this person is, which a lot of times will translate into, why does it matter? What is this relevant? What are you supposed to get out of this picture of a guy holding a book, right? If we had a descriptive title, we would have a better idea, right? What about, we're missing the figure number, right? This is obviously not a table, so it would be figure 1, 2, 3, 4. In a document, why is that figure number important? What do we lose without, or what kind of problems might we have without having this figure numbered in a document? If you think of how you use documents, particularly documents that have a number of graphics or figures in them, how does numbering those figures help you? Okay, so that's 2 things. In the text, when we refer to different figures, it's easier to figure out which figure we're talking about if we have them numbered. So as shown in figure 1, as opposed to, let's say on one page we've got 4 figures. If we don't have them numbered, then we have to do extra work to explain the figure at the bottom right-hand corner of the page, or the figure that shows A, B, C, and D, as opposed to just figure 1, right? So it's easily referenceable in the text. But also we might have, especially if we have a document that is heavy on graphics, like a lot of technical documents are, we might have a number of figures or graphics or tables that we then have listed in an index, right? So the person can easily reference that figure. They're done reading the document, but they remember, oh, there was a graphic that showed this, and it's particularly useful to me. I want to use it in my own work. And I remember the title, but I don't remember what page it is on, so I go to the index and I see figure 1, figure 2, figure 3. And so, again, it's back to the idea of easily referencing those figures, right? It's kind of a roadmap for the audience to those figures. So we want to make sure that we number these figures so they can easily be referenced. So figure number, give it a title, and then the citation. In this case, we have a problem because there's no citation. The problem there is what? Well, copyright, or in an academic setting, plagiarism, right? I didn't actually take this picture of this person, so it doesn't belong to me. I borrowed it from someplace. And unless I cite it, then I'm technically plagiarizing. Whether it's intentional or not, if we don't cite, just like when we talk about citing text, right? If you take a direct quote, or if you paraphrase from a work and you don't give the author credit, then you're passing off as your own work. Same thing for graphics, right? If you didn't physically take that picture, if it doesn't belong to you, or if you didn't actually make this table that you're using, create it on your own, then you borrow it from somewhere, and so you have to cite it, right? So without all these things, we've got a lot of problems, right? That all stem from just not having a label. So there's one without a label, and here, same graphic, clearly labeled. Figure number 1, right? Easily you can see in the text, figure number 1, that's where I look. Edward Tuff lecturing. So I know who this person is, and I know what he's doing, right? It's not the most complicated graphic, but you get the idea. And then we have it cited, number 1 in brackets, which is how we cite in IEEE style, which tells me when I get to the reference section and I see number 1 in brackets, that's the source that graphic came from, right? And like I said, depending on the documentation style, that citation will vary. But the information that we have in this label will not, right? Figure number 1, period, give it a title, and if you have to cite it at the end. Right? All right, and here we've got, just for the sake of showing all of them, we've got a table that's labeled. Right? So we've got table, number 1, period, then we've got a title, and then at the end, we have the citation. Now, this is a citation that's using APA style, right? So parentheses, author's name, and the year. There's one other thing that's different here in the label for the in the label for the table rather than the label for the figure. That is what? Well, it's part of the table. It is. That's just, it was easy for me to put it up that way. So it's not quite that it's part of the table.
In the table, the number will be above the table, but in figures it below.
Right? In table, when we have tables, the label goes above it. When we have figures, the label goes below. Right? Don't ask me why. That's just how we do it. Right? So figures get labeled below, and tables get labeled above. Again, same basic information, just the placement of it's different, right? Any questions so far? Okay, it's not super complicated stuff, but it is important, like we said. So we'll keep moving. All right, the next point, we want to make sure that we explain and reference graphics in the text. So like we said, we tell the audience exactly what they're supposed to be understanding as they're looking at the graphic, and we tell them where to look in the graphic, right? Because a lot of graphics, or tables, or both, are complicated enough that there's more than one thing the audience can look at. And if we don't tell the audience what to look at in the graphic, what are they going to look at? If there are 5 different things to look at, we want them to look at number 1. What are they going to, but we don't tell them what are they going to look at. Everything else, right? Unless we tell them what to look at, they're not going to look at it. So we want to make sure we reference in the text what the, this is all code. Well, it's not all code. That's no good. So just imagine that here we've got a graphic, right, which is a total station. You can kind of read this. I see what you're saying. It didn't show up this way on my computer. I thought it would be fine.
This version must be the old version of PowerPoint or something.
Maybe, yeah, maybe so. Okay. Well, so let's just imagine, right? Here we've got a figure of a total station, right? And here I can kind of read and maybe put this together, so just listen up. Major advancements have been made in the technology of techniques and equipment used by surveyors. The most common tool used today by surveyors is a total station. These machines electronically measure distances and can be programmed for leveling. In the past, surveyors needed teams of 2 or more men, but now surveying can be done with a single surveyor. This is possible with the new modern equipment. A total station works by shooting light from the station to the target. The target then relays the light back to the station. Once the light returns to the station, then they can process the length and angle. In the past, surveying large lots has been nearly impossible and very time-consuming. With new technology, surveyor, that's probably enough. You guys get the point, right? Anywhere in this explanation have we pointed to this graphic? No, right? We talk a lot about a total station, and we can see that this is a total station, but we haven't explained what this total station is. We haven't pointed out specific parts of it. If we're looking at a picture of a device, typically we're going to explain what about that device? How it works, or what it's used for, right? We've talked a little bit about what it's used for, and we've kind of barely mentioned how it works, but we haven't pointed out specific things. We know that it shoots light. Where might it shoot light from in this graphic? Well, we might guess it shoots it out of this lens, but we don't know unless they tell us, right? So, and again, it's kind of a simple graphic, so there's not a whole lot of guessing we have to do, but it's not always going to be the case. So we want to make sure, in this case, we haven't explained and referenced the graphic, right? And so there are a lot of things, we leave it up to the audience. That's the problem, is without explaining and referencing the graphic, we leave it up to the audience to figure it out. And we don't want our audience to have to figure it out. That's our job, is telling them what they're supposed to get out of it. So in this case, we haven't explained it. Now again, just bear with me. Major advancements have been made in technology and techniques and equipment used by surveyors. The most common tool used today by surveyors is the total station, shown in figure 1 below, right? We've told them where to look. These machines electronically measure distances and can be programmed for leveling. A total station works by shooting light using the circular lens shown in the figure. right? So we told them where to look in the figure so they understand how the thing works. From the station to the target then relays the light back to the station. Once the light returns, the station can then process the length and the angle. There's not much difference after that point. But you see, by doing something as simple as saying, shown in the figure below, we know that we're supposed to look here for information. We know, I can't keep tapping the board. I'm going to pull up menus. And we know from here, it works by shooting light using the circular lens shown in the figure, right? So again, even something as simple as pointing out to the figure, pointing to the figure and referencing it in our explanation makes it much clearer to the audience what they're supposed to be getting out of it. Why is this important? How does it work? Why is it relevant to me? Right? So here we've got, to some extent, we could probably go into more detail, but we've got to some extent the graphic explained and referenced in the text. All right, and here the main point is that we've got the explanation, same as in the last slide, and we've got it right next to the graphic. So we're not separating the explanation from the graphic by a page break or by 3 or 4 page breaks, right? So like we said earlier, the idea is that when we read an explanation of a graphic, as a reader, it's easier for us to read it and understand it if we can see that graphic on the same page as the explanation, as opposed to having to flip back and forth, right? So keep it as close, the graphic placement, last point here, keep it as close to the text as you feasibly can. Now sometimes it just might not work out. You might have to separate it by a page break. Or it might be a situation where all the graphics have to be at the end of the document. And you know, certain situations call for different things. But if you can place it near the explanation, it's going to work better for your audience, right? It's going to make it easier for them. And that's really, at the end of the day, what we want to try and do. All right, so we'll immediately follows the explanation. Hopefully we'll not have any more graphic problems. Okay, so now, those are the 4 main rules for incorporating graphics, right? As long as we take care of those 4 things, we should be just fine. The audience should know what they need to get out of the graphic, where to get it, and move on to the next thing I got to do. Now, the second main point here is choosing effective graphics. So when we are trying to figure out what kind of graphics to use, whether they're graphics that we're going to borrow or graphics that we're actually going to put together, we want to make sure that we use graphics that, like I said at the beginning of the lecture, that work well for our audience, that are efficient, that make it easy for them to understand and understand it quickly so they can move on to the next thing. And also do so in a way that we have to write less, so they have to read less. Here we've got a graphic. How well does this graphic work? Is there anything, well, maybe I should back up. Effective graphics are clear, legible, and as simple as possible, right? So what this means is that all graphics need to be easy for the audience to look at. They need to be able to easily get the information off of the graphics, right? If we're talking about text on a graphic, you've got to be able to read it, because if you can't read the labels on a graphic, are they doing any good? No, they're not any help if you can't read it. And they also should be as simple as possible. So we'll talk a little bit more about this in a little bit, but when we talk about using graphics, we want to keep all the information as simple as possible. We don't want to add unnecessary information or falsely indicate information when there is none. What I mean by this is, I'll give you 2 examples. If you can give me a bar graph in a document, and you can fully explain with that bar graph what you need to by having it be 2 colors, black and white, and be in 2D, so just no third dimension. Or you can give me the same bar graph, but you can put it in color. So one bar is blue, one's red, one's green, one's yellow, whatever. And also make it 3D. So that's got, the 3 axes. Which of those 2 options is better and why? Is the colorful one that looks fancy better, or the simpler 2D one better? 2-color 2D one. 2D in 2 colors, why is that better than the 3 and the colorful one? It's simpler, right? We're not communicating any more information. And sometimes I'll have students that will say, well, but the one that's in color and 3D looks better. And it gets my audience's attention, right? Fair enough. If what's getting your audience's attention is the colors that you've used arbitrarily in the graphic and the 3D that is not adding information, we've got more serious problems than the graphic, right? So we want to keep it as simple as possible. No one is going to be impressed by the fact that you put your graphic in color or that you made it 3D, as much as they will be impressed by the content and how easily that content is communicated to them. And it's more easily communicated if there's fewer things to look at and think about. 2D gets the job done just as well as color, so 2D is better. It's less to have to think about. If we put that same bar graph in 3 or 4 colors, so one bar is red, one's blue, one's green, one's yellow, the audience might think what? Or ask themselves what kind of questions? What does it mean that this bar is yellow? And why is that one red? Is there a difference there that I'm not seeing? And if there's a reason for them to be different colors, go for it. That's fine. If there's a reason, if there's something that's communicated with 3D, completely fine. If it's helpful, that's good. But if it's not adding anything, it's potentially adding questions that lead to nowhere. And that's what we want to avoid, right? So simplicity. So here we've got a graphic. How well does this graphic work? Are there any problems with this graphic? Okay, it's not very clear. The labels aren't clear. They're hard to read, right? They're blurry, and these labels look like they're kind of cut off. And this one looks like it's kind of cut off, right? We don't want to cut words off in the middle because they're harder to read, right? If it's hard to read, it's hard to get the information out as easily as it should be. What else? Any other problems we've got with this graphic? We don't have a title, we don't have a label, and I'll go ahead and tell you this. All the graphics that we're going to look at for the rest of the time don't have labels. So just figure that we're past labels now. We're just going to focus on the graphics themselves. But it might be more helpful if it did have it would be more helpful if it did have a label. It looks kind of squished, right? It's kind of compressed, like we needed to stretch it out more, right? And maybe make it bigger. Maybe if we made it larger, those words would be clearer. And it wouldn't seem, when we squish this down, it might skew the data because it's compressed it in such a way, right? Especially since what we're looking at here is a completely visual kind of thing. We're looking at the relation between these two lines, right? And if we've squeezed it, we're not going to get the right idea, right? So, the actual scale of the graphic in this case is a problem. So it's blurry, we've kind of compressed it, it's not large enough, right? It could be larger and we'd probably get the idea more easily. It is fairly simple, and that's working in its favor, right? There's not a whole lot of stuff going on that's distracting, but we've got these other issues with it. Now, what about this graphic? Better, worse, why? It's a little better? Sure. What's better about this one? You can read the text, right? Say it again for me.
The labeling of the parts.
Sure. We've got labels that are clearly readable, and they're clearly associated with the things that they're there to explain, right? It's fairly simple, right? It's a little bit more complicated than the last one, but it's fairly simple. It doesn't take us very long to look at this graphic to get a full understanding of what's going on, especially if we had that explanation in the text, right? So here we've got, and it's also larger, right? Takes up more of the screen, which in a document, is more of an issue because you've got a limited amount of space. But the graphics need to be as large as they need to be as large as they need to be, right? So if it needs to be bigger so you can read the words or you can see all the different things that are going on in the graphic, then you need to make it bigger. If we could shrink this down without blurring the text or without obscuring any of the parts of the graphic, then go ahead and shrink it down. But we want to make sure, sometimes the tendency might be to say, well, this graphic looks too large, it takes up half a page. Well, if it has to take up half a page and it's the right graphic, then it just has to take up half a page, right? If by making it smaller you sacrifice the content and you obscure some of the information in that graphic, that's a problem. We want to avoid that, right? So, okay, here we've got a clearer graphic, it's more legible, we can actually read the words, and it's simple, right? Maybe a little more complicated than the last one, but it's still fairly simple. We don't have a lot of unnecessary colors, right? It's in 2D, right? If we put this in 3D, would it make any more sense? Probably not, right? We get the basic idea here. So this is good, right? We've got a better graphic here. Now, I've got a few example graphics that I want to take a look at and just kind of see what we think about them and what kind of things we could do to improve them or what kind of things they do well. And again, like I said, some of these have figure labels and some of them don't. So we'll kind of skip over the labeling issues here. How do we feel about this graphic?
Scale or scale?
Okay, we don't have any idea of scale, right? And we're probably, why might that be important in this case?
I don't know, is it a rock or cell
Okay,
size?
it's hard to figure out what we're looking at, right? Is it a cell or is it something much smaller? Or is it something much larger, right? How might we fix that on this graphic? Now, there's not one way. There might be a handful of different ways we could do it. You could put a scale on it, right? We might could actually add, if you're good at Photoshop or however you want to do it, you might could actually add a scale. I don't know, it's not an inch big, but just off the top of my head, just say, here's 1 inch, here's 2 inches. That gives us a better idea of how big it is, right? Or, in some cases, it wouldn't really apply to this one, but in some cases you might say we had a graphic of a computer chip, right? And computer chips are lots of different sizes, but they're all fairly small. We put a picture of a computer chip up here, but without anything to scale it by, we don't know how large it is. So maybe we take something like a pen and stick it next to the computer chip so we can relate it to something, right? So in this case, we've got an image that is fairly clear and it's got a descriptive title, but it's hard to figure, we don't have a scale, right? Now we could take care of that in the text, but we could also do it in the graphic itself. And so maybe that'd be a way to improve it. Anything else? Anything else good or bad about this slide? Okay, if we can get a picture in color, this might be a time where color actually adds to the graphic, where it makes it easier to understand, right? I don't know, I'm not a biology guy, but I would imagine if we're talking about red blood cells, it'd probably be red, right? Or if we're talking about white blood cells, I'm sure they're not white, but the different color would help us understand or get a better picture of it more easily, right? So, again, like I said a few minutes ago, if color is arbitrary, then we want to leave it out. But if color helps explain something, if it helps illustrate something, that means we have to explain it less in the text, that's when color is good. And in this case, we might could put this in color and it'd do a better job, right? All right, let's move on to the next one. What's happening in this figure? Okay, the contrast isn't very good, right? Does anybody know what we're looking at? You can probably figure it out from the labels. It's a bullet, but it's hard to tell, right? Because why? Why is the contrast not good? We have a black background, and the picture itself, what we're supposed to be looking at, is fairly dark, right? So they don't stand out from each other, right? So it's hard for if the things in the graphic we want the audience to see are not contrasting well, they're not going to be able to see them, right? And so that's a problem. So in this case, what can we do to fix that? Maybe we can change the color, right? Maybe we can, if you're particularly good at that kind of thing, maybe we can change the background, which will make the bullet part stand out, right? There's one other thing we could do. It might be even better.
The size?
Maybe we can make it larger, right? If we make it larger, maybe it'll be a little bit easier to see. Or in some cases, maybe making it smaller might make it easier to see. Sure. Anything else we maybe could do? Find another graphic, right? So just because we found this graphic first doesn't mean it's going to be the best one, right? Especially if we're talking about going out and finding graphics from other sources. Be picky and choosy about the graphics that you use. Just because it's the first one that pops up on Google doesn't mean it's going to be the best one, right? So find graphics that are clear, right? That are relevant to the things you're talking about, that are more relevant than others, right? In some cases, we've got some terminology, primer, casing, and bullet. Let's just say that there are 3 or 4 different words for this, or terms that people use, jargon, so on. And in our document, we don't use primer. We call it something else. We call it back end. I don't know, off the top of my head. Maybe, since we use a different term, we need to find a graphic that uses the same terminology, so there's not questions, right? So be picky about the kind of graphics that you use. Yeah, we might could fix this one to make it stand out more clearly. We might could also just find a better picture, right? Anything else with this graphic?
And the caption, like primer, casing, the white background is not good. I would cancel the white background.
Okay. So then if we took out the white background, then we'd have black text on a black background. We can't really see that, but
I will change the color of the word to red or yellow.
okay, we would change the color of the actual text, right? And I would say, if we're talking about a professional kind of document, we might want to avoid red or yellow. They might seem a little bit more elementary than we mean. And also because we've got white, how well does white contrast on black or vice versa? It's very good, right? It's their exact opposite. So we might actually get rid of the box and just make the text white, right? And that way it'll stand out. And that might also help out here because it might draw the attention here more so than the things around it a little bit better. So there's a lot of different ways we can handle it. None of them are any more right than the others, but we want to figure out what works best for us, what works best for this figure if we are stuck with this one, we can't find another one, right? All right, let's look at the next one. What's going on with this graphic? Good or bad? Why?
The contrast for the lines is too thick.
Okay, yeah, the lines in this graphic are they're fairly thin, and they
They're dominating the picture. They are dominating the picture.
okay, and so there's two things. The lines, if I understand you right, the lines of the actual figure of the crankcase are a little thin. They don't show up as well, especially because the lines of the labels are so much thicker, and they take the focus away from this and put it on the bold, right? These lines are in bold. What do we use bold for?
For like
Highlighting for emphasis, because we put things in bold because we want the audience to pay attention to it. Is this what we want the audience to pay attention to in this figure? These lines? No, right? It's what they're pointing to. And so we might actually reverse that and make the labels have regular lines and bold, or at least thicken up the lines of the actual graphic, right? What else? All right, what about the color?
It's too dull.
Yeah, it doesn't really show up very well. And so if it's not showing up very well, is it doing any work for us? Not really, right? So maybe we can make, we've got the outline in black on white, so that's good. But then we've got these little circles that are kind of light blue, right? Which they're supposed to represent, gas and air. Could we make them darker blue? Probably so, and we'd be able to see them more easily. Then we've got some parts that are purple, right? This part up here is purple, and this part down here is purple. They're purple for a reason, right? Because we want to see the difference between this part, and then this part, the crankshaft, and then all the different parts that they've got. We've got them in different colors because they stand out. But these colors don't really stand out, right? And so, again, if we were creating this graphic, then we could just change the colors ourselves, easy enough. If we are borrowing this graphic, this might be a time where we want to find a better one, right? Because this one's a little bit too dull, right? It doesn't stand out. It doesn't call attention to the parts in the graphic that we want to call attention to, right? So this is this is a good use of color, right? Because we're trying to show differentiation between the different parts in the graphic. What else? Anything else here with this graphic?
Font size of a legend is a little bit small.
Yeah, right, and it's not even consistent, right? We've got some parts, fuel intake port, poppet valve, these are all small, but they're all the same size. Over here, combustion chamber is smaller. Why is it smaller? Is it less important than the other parts? I don't know, right? There's probably no reason for it to be smaller, but it is, and that's a problem. So we want things to be consistent, but we also want them to be large enough so they can be easily read. And we can make these larger, maybe not a lot larger, but a little larger, so that they're a little bit more easy to read. What else? Anything else about this graphic?
Is that a crankshaft? Is that a two words or a single word? Crankshaft.
Off the top of my head, I don't know. I think it might be one word.
Okay.
But the point you're bringing up is proofread, right? Especially if you are putting together a graphic, you want to make sure that if crankshaft is one word, that it appears as one word. If it's two, it needs to be two, right? So consistency. We want to make sure they're follow grammatical rules, that they're spelled the way they need to be spelled, they appear the way they need to appear. The other thing here that we'll point out real quickly about this graphic is that we have a caption to it, right? We've got a little note at the bottom that says, this picture has been modified to include the labels of the parts. This tells us what? That the picture's been changed, right? So in the original, here we've got a citation. If we go, and I know it's on the top, it's supposed to be underneath it, but if we go to source number 1, which is where this figure is, and we flip to page whatever, and we see the figure, these things, these labels are not going to be there, right? We've added them for our purposes because it's easier for us to explain, or it takes the focus off the text. Whatever reason we've got, if we want to modify a graphic, we just need to say so, right? So tell your audience that you've actually changed it from the way it appeared normally. That way, when they go look it up in source number 1, they don't get there and look out. The labels aren't there, and now they're confused, right? So you kind of tell them what's going to happen when they go and look it up. All right, and the last one here, what's going on here? Problems, issues, or good things about this graphic? The picture should be in the center, right? It looks like we haven't sized this right? The graphic is only this big. Why do we have all this extra white space? There's no reason. It looks like we just threw it, like we just found it off a website and we just threw it in our, in this case, slide or our document, right? So we want to, any kind of formatting that we have to do with graphics to make it, this is kind of a superficial thing, but it's a case of effort, right? It looks like it took us 2 seconds to put this slide together. And if it looks like it took us 2 seconds to put this slide together, what else might that imply about the information or us as a communicator, right? Not good things. It doesn't imply good things. So we want to make sure it looks like we took some time to put this thing together well. In this case, shrinking it down so we don't have this extra white space, right? So the formatting is a problem. What else?
Background is not adding anything, I guess.
The color of the background, you mean? Yeah, right. We've got this kind of weird yellow background that there's no reason for it, right? And if it's just part of the graphic, then that's just, it's probably easier to leave it like it is. But we could maybe put a border around this to show that, this is how it existed to begin with. And, I gotta quit touching the board here. And the text isn't readable, right? So we're not learning, you guys can you read this at all? It's hard for me to read it, and I'm right next to it, right? So if it's hard for your audience to read the text, that text isn't doing any good. So we want to make sure that it's legible, right? In this case, we could probably also stand to have some labels. Certainly, the figure label, figure 1, what it is we're looking at, would be helpful, right? But at the very least, we want it to be legible, right? So in this case, a handful of different problems, that being one of the smaller ones probably. Okay, so that's kind of the end of the lecture section of incorporating graphics, figuring out what kind of graphics we want to use. This is just a citation for the picture of Edward Tuff we had earlier. Reminding you guys, this is the website that you can go to find all of the materials that we've been using in these workshops. Next workshop will be in 2 weeks from today on documenting sources. Okay, so like I said, that's the end of the lecture section. We do have a little bit of time left. So what I have here that I want to try is I've got a short little worksheet that's got 4 different graphics on it. And what I'm going to do is pass this out and have you guys work in groups, groups of 2 or 3, and look at these graphics and figure out what's wrong with them, right? Talk about it, figure out what you could do to fix it. So 2 things. Figure out what's wrong with these graphics, why are they a problem, and what you would do to revise them, right? We talk about revising text. We can revise graphics just the same, right? So I'll go ahead and pass these out. I got way more than I need, but I'll get these passed out. So take a few minutes, look at them, and then, like I said, you can partner up or get in groups of 3. It doesn't, whatever you want to do, and come up with some issues, come up with some ways to fix these. So I'll give you guys about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll talk about them all together, and we'll see what we can do. don't know if you want to look at one of those. I got a bunch of them at one of these. And Richard was supposed to send one to me by email so we could look at it. Yeah, I pulled those from.
It's really hot sitting right there
Oh,
for
yeah.
some reason.
I pulled those from the textbook we used to use when I first started.
The engineering handbook, the
No, it was before that. It was a book by Mike Markle called Technical Communication. It was like an actual textbook.
okay.
Any case, I've still got the
You
book.
ever miss using a textbook with the students, or you like it better?
Mm-mm. Yeah.
I like it so much.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, let's start with the first one. Here we've got a table. What kind of problems do we have with this table?
Formatting is uneven.
Okay, yeah, the formatting's not even, particularly these numbers, right?
Yeah, that's the.
Right? So, you know, something as simple as format, it doesn't take very much. We just want to make sure they all line up.
And it's too compact. Probably we can increase the size.
Okay, we could certainly make it bigger. It's a little bit hard. There's a lot of, it seems very busy. I mean, like you said, compact. Let's stick with the formatting real quick. Let's say we get these back in line. So 196, 203, 201. Is there anything else we can do with these?
Columns.
We might have columns, right? We might also have rows, right? So it's easier to line these things up. What about the lining of the actual numbers? This is easier to see.
It is like, it would be great if everything had the same front face.
Probably the ascending or the descending.
Okay, we might can order the actual, might can order them by number as opposed to, how are they ordered right now?
Or else the alphabet would be.
Alphabetical, right? So it might be better to order them by the numbers. Also, when we have numbers, do we typically want them to line up on this side or on this side? On the right side. If we think of how we add, you know, subtract, it would make sense that these actually line up on this side, not on the right side, not on the left, right? How else maybe we could order these by number, by amount? We could order them alphabetically. Is there any way we could order these?
By the alphabets.
Well, aside from by alphabetical order. Maybe we could take the engineering degrees and have them all together, and then we could take the liberal arts degrees and have them together, right? We've got two clear kind of sections. So, you know, it depends. A lot of different ways we could organize these, and if what we want to show is that there are more in foreign languages than anything else, then maybe we order it based on number. If what we want to show is the difference between engineering colleges and liberal arts colleges, maybe we group them this way, right? If none of it matters, if it's just random, then maybe we leave it like it is, right? What else? Anything else we could do with this graphic, or anything else we'd need to do? Say it again. That's it. Yeah, those are the main things, right? The formatting, easy stuff. The way that it's ordered, that's really the main issue. Is the way it's ordered seems to be fairly random, or alphabetical order doesn't seem to be the best way to order it. And so, you know, again, like I said earlier, when we are in this case, if we're putting together graphics, we want to think about what's the best way to represent this information. And if alphabetical order is the best way, that's how we should do it. Or if we can communicate, if we can indicate, in this case, the relations. That's what we're trying to show. Better by grouping them differently, then we group them differently, right? You'll know. When you're putting these things together, you'll know. Okay, so let's move over to the second one here. What are problems that we have with this graphic?
It doesn't start from 0.
Okay, it doesn't start from 0, right? Why is that a problem?
It makes a large difference actually. We can't compare it in the true sense. Yeah, that makes a lot of change.
Right. This one, and there's another thing that kind of makes this problem worse, but let's just compare 1930 and 1940. Now, we don't start at 0, which is a problem because how much more does it seem like 1940 is than 1930? Just looking at it.
Major difference.
It looks like a big difference. How much of a difference is it?
2000.
It's only 2,000, right? It's only a third difference. This one is only a third larger or more than this one, but that's not what it looks like. But if we started at 0, it would be clear, right? Is there anything else we could do aside from starting all the way from 0 and going all the way up?
Probably we can start at 1,000.
We could probably start from maybe 1,000, and a lot of times you'll see something in a graphic that looks like, or it's got some kind of squiggly line that shows you that you've compressed it, right? Because none of them are different from 3,000 to 0, and so space constraints. But if that's what we're doing, we want to make sure that's clear so that it doesn't, so it's not easy for the audience to look at this and misunderstand, right? And think that they all start at 0 because that's a much different picture than what we really have. So that's okay, that's one thing, couple of things. What else? Okay, a bar graph as opposed to, what's the problem with what we've got here? It's a little messy. That's kind of being nice. It's not professional, right? Why is it not professional? The picture, right? If we're trying to show amounts, we'll get to that in a second. We want a bar graph, right? We don't need a picture of a cartoon, right? The cartoon's not adding anything. It's actually making the graphic harder to understand, right? Because it's not, with a bar graph, the only thing that's different from bar to bar is the height, right? The width is the same. But since we've made these cartoons, this one, they scale up, right? And so it follows that scale. So that, again, it kind of further makes it seem like 1940 is much larger than 1930. It's not really the case. Also, to make it as simple as possible, there's not really much place for cartoons in our technical graphs. So we want to make these bars, right? What else? Anything else that would make this graphic easier to understand? Right? What do these numbers mean? We don't know. It could be people enlisted in the Merchant Marines. It could be people leaving the Merchant Marines. I don't think it's particularly dangerous for the military, but maybe it's people that died or whatever it might. We don't know, right? So we want to label it. We've got it labeled down here. But that label in itself is a problem. Why? It's not really a label so much as it's a title, right? These are what? Years, probably, right? But it's mislabeled to say Merchant Marines, which doesn't really make sense, right? So labeling, making sure it's clearly labeled. One other thing that might be helpful, especially if we've got a bar graph, is having the rows so we can see clearly where the bar reaches, because they don't all reach exact amounts here, right? This one doesn't go quite to 6,000, and it's harder to see that without these lines. Is there anything else we could do to make that better or clearer, maybe?
Probably color the bar.
Color the bars?
Graph area.
Okay.
So that it will be much more specific.
Okay. There's one other thing we could probably add to that. Color the bars in and do what?
And mention
And
the
put the amount in here, right? So let's just say we had this bar and we said we got the exact amount because it doesn't fit or it doesn't go all the way up to the next amount, right? Okay, that's probably about all the real bad stuff with that one. Let's look at the next one. No, those don't stay with it. Moving kind of slow here. All right. What about what we've got here? What are problems with this graph?
the extra part, the graph is covered with, it's showing that it's Xerox.
Oh, yeah, so it's clearly Xerox. Let's not worry about that. That's just the best I could do. But with the actual graphic, what's problematic here?
Probably we can use a color.
We could probably use colors, right? We've got a pie chart. What we're trying to see in any kind of pie chart is how these different pieces of the pie match up. And when we're trying to see how they match up, it's important to see how they're different. And color, in this case, actually it emphasizes those different pieces. So that would be an improvement. What else?
And we can label them separately with the color.
Okay, if we use colors, then we don't have to have these words coming off of the wheel, right? Which are hard to read, right? And this one's upside down. So that's not doing us a whole lot of good, right? What else? There's one other kind of big thing. If we're talking about a pie chart, in this case, the title of this is Expenses at this Corporation. What we're trying to see is how the different pieces of the pie stack up to each other, match up. What might make that
Mentioning the number.
the actual amount, right? Like 20%, and this one's 22%, right? So these are all the pieces of this pie are fairly similar. And so without exact amounts, it's hard for us to get an idea of how they're different, right? These two might look the same, but one's a little bit bigger than the other one. And is this one bigger than this one? It's hard to tell because they're not next to each other. But if we've got the amount, we'll know, right? What else? Anything else we can do differently with this one? There are a handful of different ways we could probably deal with these labels. You know, we could color code the chart, and we could include a legend, right? Or we could also have them pointed and have them all horizontal, right? Which, depending on what we're trying to show, might be better, because having a graphic that just has labels versus having a graphic that also has a legend, one's simpler than the other. But, you know, it depends on the situation. Okay, anything else with that one? I think this is the main stuff. All right, let's. What about this last one here? Cost of the components of a PC. You like this one? The labels are hard to read. Right? We don't typically read from bottom up, right? So we want to read horizontally. Is there anything else we could do to make that, to get those words horizontal without writing them out horizontally underneath? Okay, yeah, we could label them here. And so you get the point. Could we switch the axes? So we could label it monitor here, memory here, power, etc. Maybe we can, maybe we can't. But we might can. If we can, that'd be easier to read. And it would leave all of this stuff, it wouldn't clutter up the rest of the graphic, right? Okay, so that's a couple of things, mostly being able to read the labels. What else? You think that's it? Well, let me ask you this. How much is the power supply? How much does a power supply cost? Maybe that's what I should ask. 140 between 140 and 160. We don't have an exact amount. Let me ask you this. Is it in dollars or euros or yen or we don't know, right? So labeling, cost in dollars or whatever. In some situations, you might not need that, right? But in some cases, you might. And I would say, you know, since we don't have exact, we can either add those exact numbers in like we talked about with the bar graph, or include lines so we can see. It's still not quite exact, but it's better. We might even, you can see how we're complicating this graphic probably unnecessarily to keep it like it is. And so what I'm getting at here is this the right kind of graph? Is a line graph what we need here? What do you use a line graph to show? A trend, right? It starts off and it moves, right? Are we showing a trend? No. We need what kind of graph? A bar graph, right? We're just trying to show how much these different components cost relative to each other. And so we don't even have the right kind of graph, right? This is what we want. And so on, right? So again, picking the right kind of graphic, right? Or revising it so that it works as best as it can. Anything else with this one? There's one other thing that I'll point out. It's not quite a graphic-related thing, but it is an issue. What about the title? Cost of the components of a PC. This is not something we talked about today, but it's something that you probably, I think, might have been covered in one of the earlier workshops. Conciseness and clarity. How can we make this title more concise?
Components of a PC. Probably of the can be removed.
Get rid of prepositional phrases, right? What if we did this? We get the same idea there? Yep. And we took 7 words and made it 3. And we hadn't lost any information, right? So again, when we talk about being concise, it doesn't end when we get to graphics. So you can still be concise. And arguably, when we talk about graphics, which are visual, which work by giving the audience an idea quickly and easily, even more so than reading, concise titles is arguably just as important as anywhere else, right? Okay, so, these not super complicated graphs, but graphs that have problems that are easy to see, easy to figure out how to revise. You guys have any questions? I know it's just 2 of you guys left, but any questions about anything that we talked about today with graphics, incorporating graphics, picking graphics? No? Okay, well good. Again, it's not the most complicated stuff in the world, but it takes a little bit of thought, right? Just making sure you follow the guidelines that we have. Okay, well, thanks y'all for sticking around. If you guys want some more food, take as much as you want, and we'll see you guys maybe at the next one in a couple weeks.